If you want to get from the center of Madrid to the center of Valencia in less than 2 hours, it'll run you 10 or 20 bucks. If you want to go from the center of New York City to the center of Boston, which is a shorter distance, it's gonna be more like 4 hours, and you're certainly not gonna be paying 10 bucks. I regret to inform you it's policy failure week on this channel, and it's coming up next. This is CityNerd, weekly content on cities and transportation. Viewer-suggested topics, always welcome. And I've gotten more requests to talk about Acela than just about anything else. Like, this one from Patreon is really long, and I do cringe at the idea of someone watching one of my videos 5 times, especially the first video I ever made, where the content itself is fine, but the production is even more amateurish than what I'm doing now. Is it still bad to just bulldoze existing development in the name of progress? Like, this is an obviously outrageous question, but it says something about how enormously frustrating it is that our nation can't seem to build a single useful piece of modern high-speed rail anywhere. And the first time we actually do, it's probably going to be between like Bakersfield and Fresno. Let me just recap my overall take on the Acela corridor. Because of the travel demand that gets generated when you have multiple overlapping large city pairs in a straight line, there's something like an order of magnitude more benefit in upgrading this corridor than you would get from building anything anywhere else in the US. And there are segments between New York and DC that operate at decent speeds, so I really want to focus on New York to Boston today. And I am going to do my usual thing where I compare travel times and costs among different modes. But I do want to acknowledge that most people don't sit down and make rational calculations. Human psychology and behavior is unfortunately much stupider than that, to the point where even though there's basically no measure by which taking an airplane from Paris to Lyon made sense anymore, people were still doing it just out of habit or weird train phobia. So France finally just had to ban flights. So I'm not going to do the race format I usually do, but I do want to introduce a scenario just to illustrate. Also, people complained that when I did this in other videos, I always had a sports theme, like people racing to get to a hockey game in another city or whatever. So instead, my main character for today is like a tech guy who's really into urbanism and doesn't care about sports at all. They just don't have time for such frivolities. They don't have the capacity to enjoy jaw-dropping displays of athleticism, human drama, and raw emotion. Oh, also important to note, he can bill his time at like $100 an hour, which puts him well in the upper quintile for the US, but means he's living in a studio in Long Island City. Let's say 43rd and Crescent, since our urbanist boy wants to be in the middle of all the transit. On this particular Tuesday, our character is stuck on a tedious Zoom call until 5 p.m. and he can't leave his apartment until the end of the call because he's screen sharing a bunch of important stuff that's on his laptop. But he has a conference he has to attend the next morning, and it's at the Hyatt Regency Boston, so that's where he's staying tonight. He's all packed and he'd love to get to Boston early enough to grab a late dinner and maybe even meet up with some friends before he calls it a night. So I am going to spend some time going through the math of all this and what the value proposition of high-speed rail between New York and Boston actually is. And I would usually spend some time talking about highway trips, but let's just dispense with that and say, if you're leaving at any reasonable time on a weekday, it's going to be very unpredictable and you're going to want to plan on at least 5 hours. I'm not saying driving's never going to be an option. Maybe it's a family trip, but it's pretty terrible otherwise. Too much time, too much frustration, and hard to get anything productive done or even just enjoy the journey. First, let's review the starting points for our trip. For any train journey out of the city, it's going to be Penn Station, Moynihan Train Hall. I know Moynihan gets a lot of grief for not having much seating, and I do think it's an issue when Acela trains run as infrequently as they do. But if you squint and imagine a world where high-speed trains leave every 15 or 20 minutes, as they should, you can start to see why train stations in European countries that have well-developed high-speed rail don't have much seating either. For air travel, you can fly direct to Boston out of any of the 3 airports, but let's spend a bit of time on LaGuardia, which should be the preferred airport for shorter flights for the majority of the people living in the city. Also, let's look at another viewer comment. Perhaps you could do a video on the LaGuardia transit situation. The AirTrain got canceled and options for extending the subway to LGA or connecting the LGA to the subway using light rail have been knocked back. Let me know if you want me to do a video like that, but I think the important takeaway here is if you give me 10 bucks, I will definitely read your comment. I'm not going to go through the whole LaGuardia transit saga here, but I'm just going to point out that after considering subway extensions and light rail, it looks like they settled on shuttle buses that will probably get stuck in all the usual congestion around the airport. It's just absolutely wild to me that there's no train connection at this airport. I kind of expect Vancouver to do better than everyone else at this point, but even like St. Louis and Cleveland figured this out. So let's talk about cost in terms of both dollars and time of our 2 existing non-highway travel options, starting with air. For this, I looked at prices about a month out, midweek, so for everything I'm looking at today, it's Wednesday, July 19th, 2023. For that date, I've got 49 nonstop flights to Boston out of 3 airports, 22 of them out of LaGuardia. Our urbanist tech dude is going out of LaGuardia. It's gonna be less hassle and easier to get to than the other 2 airports. Google is telling me that there are a lot of trains you can get on, but all the fastest routes put them on a Q70 bus that gets to LaGuardia at 5:41. There are a lot of philosophies and personal tolerances for how early you should try to get to an airport to account for traffic and security lines and whatever else. But I think the $129 Delta flight that leaves at 6:59 and gets him into Boston at 8:28 p.m. is probably the one he went with. On the Boston end, I'm saying disembarking and getting out of the airport is 15 minutes, and Logan Airport is very close to downtown, so transit should be a good choice. But man, I'm getting a 37-minute trip that gets him to the hotel around 9:30 p.m. Considering he has to get up early, the day is kind of shot. Really quick, I just want to point out that when you search for flights in countries where they actually have high-speed rail, Google gives you trains as an option because they're obviously a good substitute, or frankly, better than the flights themselves. I'm showing you Madrid to Valencia because I've got some recent experience with it, and the distance is comparable to New York to Boston. The 4 flights they have are as low as $36, but they're really all over the map. Google only shows you 2 trains, which is dumb. You have to go to a site like Omeo to see everything that's actually available. They're all around 2 hours, and they start at $11 for the early morning Irio, which is the Italian budget carrier. There are 26 trains in all, and 4 flights, which is probably 4 too many. Okay, let's go to the current American quote-unquote high-speed rail service, the Acela. Let me just say up front, the Acela fares, and the airfares for that matter, are gonna depend a lot on when you book. So again, just keeping it apples to apples for Wednesday, July 19th. Our urbanist boy is gonna have a shorter trip to Moynihan Hall than he had to LaGuardia. Google says he can hop an E at 5:02 and be at the station at 5:25. The Acela frequency is not great. Right now there are 10 Acelas a day that run 58 bucks and 9 conventional trains that actually only take like 28 minutes longer and cost more. It's pretty funny. His timing is decent. He should be able to get the 5:59 Acela that gets him into South Station at 9:55 p.m. That's almost 4 hours. Just remember, Madrid to Valencia is a longer distance and most of those trains are under 2 hours. I guess the silver lining is he can probably bill like 3 hours of work, but I assume he'd have been happier with a shorter trip. The other good news is it's a train, so disembarking and egress are just a couple minutes, and he can walk from South Station to the hotel pretty easily, so that's going to put him in his hotel a bit after 10 p.m., which maybe isn't worse than flying since he was able to get billable work done and it was a more pleasant experience. But just to state the obvious, what we currently have is a high-speed rail service between two major cities that are really the perfect distance apart for high-speed rail. But even with all the access and egress and security line advantages a train has, the plane is almost certainly going to get you there faster. Congratulations, America. Okay, I'm going to get into what high-speed rail service between New York and Boston should actually look like, and what we're doing about it, or maybe more accurately, what we're not doing about it. But first, quick reminder to like/dislike, subscribe, or not. Connect on the various websites if you just don't have enough of my nonsense in your life. And consider becoming a patron if you want to support the channel directly. Okay, so just for a minute, bear with me while I revisit this triangle graph that I trot out pretty much every time I talk about this subject. The whole area inside the triangle represents distances where a typical high-speed rail service should have travel time superiority over driving or flying. The train requires a bit more access and egress time than driving, but beyond a certain distance, the speed or slope of the line wins out. And then with air travel, you move at a higher speed, but there's much more access and egress time, so it takes a while for air to establish an advantage. So when you implement high-speed rail, this previously unexploited triangle really represents what, in economics, I think we'd call a massive, massive social surplus. Not only saving time for millions of travelers, but given what we know about transportation, it's gonna generate some additional travel that doesn't occur today. But I think I would call that the good kind of induced demand. Okay, so let's talk about where the US is at in terms of building an actual high-speed rail service between New York and Boston. And to understand it, we actually have to go to the website of a private organization, the North Atlantic Rail Initiative. This in itself, to me, is just pretty outrageous. You have to organize a coalition of nonprofits, colleges and universities, and labor unions to even be able to have a conversation about this stuff, because people have just given up on the federal government being the impetus for anything this useful. It's all just ridiculous. Okay, so North Atlantic Rail includes a lot of stuff not related to high-speed rail, mostly good stuff, and I'm gonna leave aside the arguments over whether we should be doing the basics to improve reliability and maintain function of the existing system versus building basically an entirely new alignment that allows trains to run at 200 miles per hour. Instead, I just want to focus on the core service, which is a new alignment out Long Island, across the Sound, under Central Hartford, and then through Providence to Boston. So it's designed for speed, and the runtime from Penn Station to South Station is proposed to be 1 hour and 40 minutes, so at least 2 hours faster than the existing service. And just to be clear, I am talking about a fantasy right now, because the stuff Amtrak applied for from the bipartisan infrastructure law has nothing to do with building an alignment where trains can go 200 miles per hour. I mean, we actually have Amtrak Joe in office, and this is the level of our ambition. It's a little depressing. And you might look at this and say, well, this is just a really, really expensive project. Tunneling under Long Island Sound? Come on. Well, the Eurostar's English Channel crossing is 30 miles long, and it connects cities that are half the size of New York that don't even speak the same language. The Long Island Sound crossing is maybe half as long. Besides, isn't there a company out there that's revolutionized tunnel boring? Why don't we just hire them to do it for cheap? I mean, unless the revolution was just making the tunnels smaller so only cars could fit in them. Okay, let's see how our tech guy fares with the new hour 40-minute service. Honestly, something like this should be running every 15 to 20 minutes at peak times, at least. But let's say it's the same departure slot as today, and he gets on a train at 5:59. That puts him into South Station at 7:39 p.m., and he's at his hotel well before 8. Restaurants are still open in Boston at 8, I assume. Our intrepid traveler just gained 2 hours that he can use to do whatever productive or unproductive thing he wants. Either way, it's a surplus you could multiply by the millions of people who would use this service every year. So why isn't this project moving forward? Why isn't any piece of it in the billion-dollar bipartisan infrastructure law? The Secretary of Transportation said he wanted the US to be leading the world when it came to access to high-speed rail. But what are we doing about it? Well, the simple answer is North Atlantic Rail is a $100 billion project. And honestly, I don't even know how accurate that is. Costs for mega projects usually get underestimated, but the fact that there's even a dollar amount at all kind of goes to my point, which is it is a lot more straightforward to estimate costs than it is to estimate benefits for this kind of thing. But we do it all the time with highway projects that run into the billions of dollars, as if the benefits of highways are super self-evident, but the benefits of trains that take cars off the road, planes out of the air, give millions of travelers hours of their lives back, and facilitate new economic activity between cities, as if those benefits are somehow dubious because they're harder to put dollar values on. If I seem annoyed, yeah, it's partly because I went to Spain and rode the high-speed trains and they're awesome. But also, it just may be that I hate air travel that much. Oh, and since we were talking about air travel, I do have a somewhat related recommendation. It's from the Underexposure series by Neo, and it's the Tenerife disaster, the subject of which is the worst aviation crash in history. I actually flew out of Tenerife North Airport a few years ago, and I was vaguely aware of what had happened there in 1977, but I had no idea the chain of wild circumstances and just plain human error that allowed something like that to happen. Anyway, the video is super tense and riveting, and it's extremely well done with the usual great animations Neo does, with reenactments of the communications between the control tower and the two planes that were involved as the disaster unfolded. It's just super harrowing stuff. So Neo's Underexposure series is exclusive to Nebula, and it's a pretty good example of why being on Nebula is so important to me. It's a platform that I know is going to support me if I decide I want to do something more involved that requires better production values or any production values. But more than that, Nebula is a structural shift in how creators can sustain what they're doing. Don't get me wrong, I super appreciate all the other ways people support me directly. But Nebula is creator-owned, so when you sign up, you're not only supporting me financially, but you're really making a statement that you value the idea of a creator-owned platform. This isn't a charity, though. Sign up for the content. If you don't know, Nebula classes did not used to be part of the subscription bundle. There are all kinds of great explainers on how Nebula creators make the incredible stuff they make. I just want to mention Trace Dominguez's How to Google Like a Pro. If it isn't already obvious, Googling is a bedrock skill of creating any kind of content in this format, and it's definitely a critical part of what makes my channel work, in as much as it works at all. And look, I think I'm pretty good at Googling. Well, Trace is a search engine assassin. Anyway, if you sign up for Nebula with the link I included down in the description, you'll be supporting me directly, and you'll get both Nebula and Nebula classes for $250 a month, which is 40% off the usual price. It's really a ton of value, and you'll feel good about yourself. And if you're already subscribed, thanks a lot. And that's all I got. Thanks for joining this week, and thanks to the patrons for supporting what I do, no matter how idiotic it gets. The direct support does mean a lot. Keep the great topic suggestions coming. I'll be back with a new episode next week, and I'll see you then.